In 1898, 2 lions in Tsavo, Kenya, hunted men and halted a railway project with fear. This is the true story, written by Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson. The Man-Eaters of Tsavo. Our story begins not with a roar, but with the hiss of steam and the turning of a ship's screw. It is the first day of March in the year 1898. A young British Lieutenant Colonel, John Henry Patterson, stands on the deck of a vessel as it carefully navigates the narrow and somewhat treacherous channel leading into the harbor of Mombasa, on the coast of what was then known as British East Africa. He is here on a mission for the Empire, an appointment from the Foreign Office to serve as an engineer on one of the most ambitious and audacious undertakings of the age, the Uganda Railway. They called it the Lunatic Line, a ribbon of steel being laid from the coast through hundreds of miles of uncharted, unmapped, and hostile wilderness to the shores of the Great Lake Victoria. Patterson was to be one of the men to tame this wild land, to lay down the tracks of progress. As his ship steamed slowly past the quaint, old Portuguese fortress, built 3 centuries before, the strange beauty of the scene struck him. He had expected a harsh, dry coast, but instead, everything looked fresh and green, shrouded in what he described as an oriental glamour of enchantment. The old town of Mombasa, bathed in the brilliant noon sun, seemed to float lazily upon the motionless sea. Its flat-roofed, dazzlingly white walls played hide-and-seek between the waving fronds of palms, the lofty crowns of coconuts, and the strange, swollen trunks of giant baobab trees. On the mainland beyond, a dark background of well-wooded hills formed a perfect setting for this beautiful, and to him, unexpected picture. The harbor was sprinkled with the elegant, curved shapes of Arab dhows, vessels that had sailed these waters for centuries, their navigators finding their way from port to port without the aid of compass or sextant, guided only by the stars and an ancient knowledge of the sea. These were the same waters where, 400 years earlier, the great explorer Vasco da Gama had almost lost his ship and his life to the treachery of a pilot who plotted to wreck him on the reef. A curious pillar, said to have been erected by da Gama himself, still stood in the town's principal street, a silent monument to that turbulent past. Scarcely had the ship's anchor dropped when the vessel was surrounded by a fleet of small boats and dugout canoes, manned by crowds of shouting, gesticulating Swahili boatmen, all fighting for the privilege of carrying the new arrival and his luggage ashore. Patterson, after being claimed by the victors of a brief but vigorous encounter, was rowed to the landing steps. His first task was to report to the headquarters of the railway. He was told they were at a place called Kilindini, some 3 miles away on the other side of the island. The best way to get there, he was informed, was by gari. This was not a carriage, but a small trolley with 2 seats under a little canopy, running on a narrow-gauge track laid through the main street of the town. Pushed by 2 strapping Swahili runners, the little vehicle flew along the rails, taking him out of the town and through dense groves of mango, banana, and palm trees, with brilliantly colored creepers hanging in lush festoons from the branches. Arriving at Kilindini, which in the local language means the place of deep waters, Patterson presented himself at the railway offices. He was told he would be stationed inland and would receive his final instructions in a day or 2. He pitched his tent under some shady palms and spent the next week exploring the island and procuring the necessary supplies for a lengthy stay up country. He learned of Mombasa's violent history, its native name, Kisiwa Mvita, which means Isle of War. It was a name well earned through centuries of siege, conquest, and rebellion, from the Portuguese who named the grim fortress, Jesus Fort, to the Arab sultans of Zanzibar, and finally to the establishment of the British Protectorate under which he now served. After nearly a week of waiting, his orders finally came. He was to proceed to a place called Tsavo, 132 miles from the coast, and take charge of the construction of the railway section there. Railhead, the very end of the line where the track laying was actively happening, had just reached this remote spot. At daylight the next morning, he boarded a special train with the superintendent of works, Mr. Anderson, and the principal medical officer, Dr. McCulloch. The journey was a passage from one world to another. After crossing from the island to the mainland on the long Salisbury Bridge, the train wound its way up through the beautiful Rabai Hills, offering lovely parting views of Mombasa and the sparkling Indian Ocean. Then, the landscape changed dramatically. They entered the Taru Desert, a flat, endless wilderness covered with poor scrub and stunted trees, carpeted with a fine, penetrating red dust that found its way into everything. This was the Nika. The train passed a few of the local Wanyika people, the children of the wilderness, and the men caught glimpses of game hiding in the thick undergrowth. The monotony was broken once when a fine male ostrich was seen striding along, seemingly racing the train. Dr. McCulloch, a keen sportsman, seized his rifle and brought the great bird down with a lucky shot. The train had to be shunted back, and it took all their strength to haul the magnificent prize aboard. As dusk began to fall, they finally arrived at their destination, Tsavo. The place was nothing more than a clearing in the vast, dense jungle. Patterson's first impression upon waking the next morning was of being hemmed in on all sides by an impenetrable growth of thorny, whitish, leafless dwarf trees. The landscape presented a ghastly and sun-stricken appearance, broken only by ridges of dark red, heat-blistered rock that jutted out above the jungle. The one redeeming feature was the river from which Tsavo took its name. It was a swiftly flowing stream, always cool and always running, a rare blessing in this part of Africa, and its banks were fringed with a welcome line of lofty green trees that provided a stark relief to the general monotony. Here, thousands of Indian coolies and other workmen were encamped, their immediate task having been to build a temporary bridge to get the railway across the river so the advance could continue. Patterson's main job was far more permanent and challenging, to erect the great stone and steel bridge that would stand for generations, and to complete all the works for 30 miles on each side of Tsavo. He surveyed what had to be done and sent his requisitions for labor, tools, and material back to the coast. Soon, men and supplies came pouring in, and the sounds of progress, drilling, blasting, and hammering, once again echoed through the district. It was a time of great energy and optimism. This happy state of affairs, however, did not continue for long. The work was about to be interrupted in a rude and startling manner. The ancient spirits of the land, it seemed, were not pleased. It began subtly. Patterson started to hear reports that two most voracious and insatiable man-eating lions had appeared upon the scene. Shortly afterwards, one or two coolies mysteriously disappeared from their tents in the night. At first, Patterson dismissed the stories. These men were good workers who had saved a fair number of rupees, and he was more inclined to believe they had been murdered by their comrades for their money. This suspicion, however, was about to be dispelled in the most brutal and undeniable way imaginable. About 3 weeks after his arrival, Patterson was roused one morning around daybreak with terrifying news. One of his jemadars, a fine, powerful Sikh named Ungan Singh, had been seized in his tent during the night and dragged off and eaten. Patterson rushed to the scene to make an examination for himself. The evidence was irrefutable. The lion's pug marks were plainly visible in the sand, and the deep furrows made by the heels of the victim showed the direction in which he had been dragged away. The jemadar had shared his tent with half a dozen other workmen, and one of his bedfellows had actually witnessed the horrifying event. He graphically described how, at about midnight, the lion had suddenly thrust its head in at the open tent door and seized Ungan Singh, who happened to be sleeping nearest the opening, by the throat. The unfortunate fellow had cried out, "Choro, let go!" and had thrown his arms up around the lion's neck. The next moment he was gone, and his panic-stricken companions lay helpless, forced to listen to the terrible struggle which took place just outside. Poor Ungan Singh must have died hard, but as one of the coolies gravely remarked to Patterson, was he not fighting with a lion? On hearing this dreadful story, Patterson immediately set out to track the animal, accompanied by a Captain Haslam who was staying at Tsavo at the time. They found it an easy matter to follow the route taken by the lion, as it appeared to have stopped several times before beginning its meal. Pools of blood marked these halting places, where the beast had likely indulged in the gruesome man-eater's habit of licking the skin off its victim to get at the fresh blood. When they reached the spot where the body had been devoured, a dreadful spectacle presented itself. The ground all around was covered with blood and morsels of flesh and bones, but the unfortunate jemadar's head had been left almost entirely intact, save for the puncture wounds from the lion's tusks. It lay a short distance away from the other remains, the eyes staring wide open with a startled, horrified look. As they examined the scene more closely, they found that the ground was considerably cut up, and they realized that 2 lions had been there and had probably struggled for possession of the body. It was the most gruesome sight Patterson had ever seen. They collected the remains as best they could and heaped stones on them. But the head, with its fixed, terrified stare, they took back to camp for official identification. This was Patterson's first direct experience of the man-eaters, and he vowed there and then that he would spare no pains to rid the neighborhood of the brutes. He little knew the trouble that was in store for him, or how narrow his own escapes from sharing poor Ongen Singh's fate would be. That very night, Patterson armed himself with his .303 rifle and a 12-bore shotgun, and sat up in a tree close to the late Jemaddar's tent, hoping the lions would return for another victim. A few of the more terrified coolies begged to be allowed to sit up in the tree with him, while all the other workmen remained in their tents, their doors no longer left open to the night air. Shortly after settling down, his hopes were raised by the sound of ominous roaring coming closer and closer. Then, as lions always do when they stalk their prey, the roaring ceased, and an eerie quiet reigned for an hour or two. All at once, however, a great uproar and frenzied cries erupted from another camp about half a mile away. They knew then that the lions had seized a victim there, and that they would see or hear nothing further of them that night. The next morning, Patterson discovered that one of the brutes had broken into a tent at Railhead Camp, whence the commotion had been heard, and had made off with a poor wretch who was lying there asleep. After a day's rest, he took up his position again that night, this time in a suitable tree near the scene of the latest tragedy. He did not at all like the idea of walking the half-mile to the place after dark, but he felt fairly safe with one of his men carrying a bright lamp close behind him. He also had a goat tied under his tree, in the hope that the lion might be tempted to seize it instead of a coolie. A steady drizzle began shortly after he had settled down, and he was soon thoroughly chilled and wet, but he stuck to his uncomfortable post, hoping to get a shot. Again, his vigil was in vain. Around midnight, he heard the same heart-rending shrieks from yet another direction, telling him that the man-eaters had once more eluded him and had claimed another victim elsewhere. At this time, the various camps for the workmen were very scattered, giving the lions a range of some 8 miles on either side of Tsavo to work upon. Their tactic seemed to be to break into a different camp each night, making it almost impossible to forestall them. It almost appeared, Patterson wrote, that they had an extraordinary and uncanny faculty of finding out the hunters' plans beforehand, so that no matter how likely or tempting a spot they lay in wait for them, the lions invariably avoided that particular place and seized their victim from some other camp. Daylight hunting in the dense, thorny wilderness was an exceedingly tiring and foolhardy undertaking. In such a thick jungle, the hunted animal has every advantage over the hunter. Still, Patterson never gave up hope of one day finding their lair, and spent all his spare time crawling about through the bewildering tangle of undergrowth, often having to be released by his gun-bearer from the sharp clutches of the wait-a-bit thorns. Many a time he succeeded in tracing the lions to the river after they had seized a victim, only to lose the trail on the rocky ground, which they seemed to carefully choose for their retreat. During this early stage of the terror, the lions were not always successful in their grisly work. 1 or 2 amusing incidents occurred to relieve the tension. On one occasion, an enterprising Indian trader, A. Bunia, was riding along on his donkey late one night when a lion suddenly sprang out at him, knocking over both man and beast. The donkey was badly wounded, and the lion was just about to seize the trader when, in some way or other, its claws became entangled in a rope by which 2 empty oil tins were strung across the donkey's neck. The rattle and clatter made by these tins as the lion dragged them after him gave the great beast such a fright that he turned tail and bolted off into the jungle, to the intense relief of the terrified trader, who quickly scrambled up the nearest tree and remained there, shivering with fear for the rest of the night. Shortly after this, a Greek contractor named Themistocles Papadimitrini had an equally marvelous escape. He was sleeping peacefully in his tent one night when a lion broke in and seized and made off with the mattress on which he was lying. Though rudely awakened, the Greek was quite unhurt, suffering from nothing worse than a bad fright. This same man, however, met a melancholy fate not long afterwards. He perished miserably of thirst while attempting to take a shortcut across the country after a cattle-buying expedition. In another incident, 14 coolies who slept together in a large tent were one night awakened by a lion suddenly jumping onto the tent and breaking through it. The brute landed with one claw on a coolie's shoulder, which was badly torn. But instead of seizing the man himself, in his hurry the lion grabbed a large bag of rice which happened to be lying in the tent and made off with it, dropping it in disgust a little distance away when he realized his mistake. These, however, were only the earlier, almost clumsy efforts of the man-eaters. Later on, as Patterson would discover, nothing flurried or frightened them in the least. They developed a complete and utter contempt for human beings, except as a source of food. Having once marked down a victim, they would allow nothing to deter them from their prize, whether he were protected by the thickest of thorn fences, sealed inside a closed tent, or sitting with his comrades around a brightly burning fire. Shots, shouting, and firebrands they alike held in utter derision. Patterson's own tent, during this initial period, was pitched in an open clearing, completely unprotected by a fence of any kind. One night, when the medical officer, Dr. Rose, was staying with him, they were awakened around midnight by hearing something tumbling about among the tent ropes. On going out with a lantern, they could discover nothing. Daylight, however, plainly revealed the pug marks of a lion right by their tent. Patterson realized then that one or other of them had had a very narrow escape. Warned by this experience, he at once arranged to move his quarters. He went to join forces with another doctor, a Dr. Brock, who had just arrived at Tsavo to take medical charge of the district. Together, they constructed a hut of palm leaves and boughs on the eastern side of the river and surrounded it with a circular boma, or thorn fence, about 70 yards in diameter, made to be thick, high, and they hoped, impenetrable. Their personal servants also lived within this enclosure, and a bright fire was kept burning throughout the night. For the sake of coolness, Patterson and Brock used to sit out under the veranda of this hut in the evenings, but it was a trying experience. For the nerves to attempt to read or write there, never knowing when a lion might spring over the boma and be upon them before they were aware. They kept their rifles always within easy reach and cast many an anxious glance out into the inky blackness that lay beyond the comforting circle of the firelight. On one or two occasions, they found in the morning that the lions had come right up to the fence, but fortunately, they never succeeded in getting through. By this time, the camps of the workmen had also all been surrounded by thorn fences, yet still the lions managed to jump over or break through some one or other of them, and regularly, every few nights, a man was carried off. The reports of the disappearance of this or that workman came into Patterson with painful frequency. As long as the main construction camp, Railhead, with its 2,000 or 3,000 men scattered over a wide area, remained at Tsavo, the coolies seemed to not take too much notice of the dreadful deaths of their comrades. Each man, Patterson supposed, felt that as the man-eaters had such a large number of victims to choose from, the chances of their selecting him in particular were very small. But when the large camp moved ahead with the railway, matters altered considerably. Patterson was then left with only a few hundred men to complete the permanent works, and as all the remaining workmen were naturally camped together, the attentions of the lions became far more apparent and made a much deeper and more terrifying impression. A regular panic consequently ensued, and it required all of Patterson's powers of persuasion to induce the men to stay on at all. He only succeeded in doing so by allowing them to knock off all regular work until they had built exceptionally thick and high bomas round each camp. Within these enclosures, fires were kept burning all night, and it was also the duty of the night watchman to keep clattering half a dozen empty oil tins which were suspended from a convenient tree. He manipulated these by means of a long rope while sitting in the relative safety of his tent, and the frightful noise thus produced was kept up at frequent intervals during the night in the hopes of terrifying away the man-eaters. In spite of all these precautions, however, the lions would not be denied, and men continued to disappear. When the railhead workmen moved on, their hospital camp was left behind. It stood rather apart from the other camps, in a clearing about 3/4 of a mile from Patterson's hut, but it was protected by a good thick fence, and to all appearances was quite secure. It seemed, however, as if barriers were of no avail against these demons, for before very long, one of them found a weak spot in the boma and broke through. On this occasion, the hospital assistant had a marvelous escape. Hearing a noise outside, he opened the door of his tent and was horrified to see a great lion standing a few yards away, looking at him. The beast made a spring towards him, which gave the assistant such a fright that he jumped backwards, and in doing so luckily upset a box containing medical stores. This crashed down with such a loud clatter of breaking glass that the lion was startled for the moment and made off to another part of the enclosure. Here, unfortunately, he was more successful. He jumped onto and broke through a tent in which 8 patients were lying. 2 of them were badly wounded by his spring, while a third poor wretch was seized and dragged off bodily through the thorn fence. The 2 wounded coolies were left where they lay, a piece of torn tent having fallen over them, and in this position Patterson and the doctor found them on their arrival soon after dawn the next morning. They at once decided to move the hospital closer to the main camp. A fresh site was prepared, a stout hedge built round the enclosure, and all the patients were moved in before nightfall. As Patterson had heard that lions often visit recently deserted camps, he decided to sit up all night in the vacated boma in the hope of getting an opportunity of bagging one of them. But in the middle of his lonely vigil, he had the mortification of hearing shrieks and cries coming from the direction of the new hospital, telling him only too plainly that our dreaded foes had once more eluded him. Hurrying to the place at daylight, he found that one of the lions had jumped over the newly erected fence and had carried off the hospital bisti, or water carrier. Several other coolies had been unwilling witnesses of the terrible scene, which took place within the circle of light given by the big campfire. The bisti, it appeared, had been lying on the floor, with his feet nearly touching the side of the tent. The lion had managed to get its head in below the canvas, seize him by the foot, and pull him out. In desperation, the unfortunate water carrier clutched hold of a heavy box in a vain attempt to save himself, and dragged it with him until it was stopped by the side of the tent. He then caught hold of a tent rope and clung tightly to it until it broke. As soon as the lion managed to get him clear of the tent, it sprang at his throat, and after a few vicious shakes, the poor bisti's agonizing cries were silenced forever. The brute then seized him in his mouth like a huge cat with a mouse, and ran up and down the boma looking for a weak spot to break through, which he presently found, dragging his victim with him, and leaving shreds of torn cloth and flesh as ghastly evidence of his passage through the thorns. Dr. Brock and Patterson were easily able to follow the lion's track, and soon found the remains about 400 yards away in the bush. There was the usual horrible sight. Very little was left of the unfortunate bisti, only the skull, the jaws, a few of the larger bones, and a portion of the palm with 1 or 2 fingers attached. On one of these was a silver ring, and this, with the man's teeth, a relic much prized by certain castes, was sent to his widow in India. Again it was decided to move the hospital, and again, before nightfall, the work was completed, including a still stronger and thicker boma. When the patients had been moved, Patterson had a covered goods wagon placed in a favorable position on a siding, which ran close to the site which had just been abandoned. In this, he and Dr. Brock arranged to sit up that night. They left a couple of tents still standing within the enclosure, and also tied up a few cattle in it as bait for the lions, who had been seen in no less than 3 different places in the neighborhood during that very afternoon. 4 miles from Tsavo, they had attempted to seize a coolie who was walking along the line. Fortunately, he had just time to escape up a tree, where he remained, more dead than alive, until he was rescued by the traffic manager, who caught sight of him from a passing train. In accordance with their plan, the doctor and Patterson set out after dinner for the goods wagon, which was about a mile away from their hut. In the light of what was to happen, it was a very foolish thing to take up their position so late, but they reached their destination in safety and settled down to their watch at about 10 o'clock. They had the lower half of the door of the wagon closed, while the upper half was left wide open for observation, facing the direction of the abandoned boma, which they could not see in the inky darkness. For an hour or two, everything was quiet, and the deadly silence was becoming monotonous and oppressive, when suddenly, to their right, a dry twig snapped. They knew that an animal of some sort was about. Soon afterwards, they heard a dull thud, as if some heavy body had jumped over the boma. The cattle, too, became very uneasy, and they could hear them moving about restlessly. Then again came dead silence. At this juncture, Patterson proposed to his companion that he should get out of the wagon and lie on the ground close to it, as he could see better in that position should the lion come in their direction with its prey. Dr. Brock, however, persuaded him to remain where he was, and a few seconds afterwards Patterson was heartily glad that he had taken his advice. For at that very moment, one of the man-eaters, although they did not know it, was quietly stalking them, and was even then almost within springing distance. They had given orders for the entrance to the boma to be blocked up, and accordingly they were listening in the expectation of hearing the lion force its way out through the bushes with its prey. As a matter of fact, the doorway had not been properly closed, and while they were wondering what the lion could be doing inside the boma for so long, he was outside all the time, silently reconnoitering their position. Presently, Patterson fancied he saw something coming very stealthily towards them. He feared to trust his eyes, which by that time were strained by prolonged staring through the darkness. So under his breath he asked Brock whether he saw anything, at the same time covering the dark object as well as he could with his rifle. Brock did not answer. He told Patterson afterwards that he, too, thought he had seen something move, but was afraid to say so lest Patterson should fire, and it turned out to be nothing after all. After this, there was intense silence again for a second or two. Then with a sudden bound, a huge body sprang at them. "The lion!" Patterson shouted, and they both fired almost simultaneously, not a moment too soon, for in another second the brute would assuredly have landed inside the wagon. As it was, he must have swerved off in his spring, probably blinded by the flash and frightened by the noise of the double report, which was increased 100-fold by the reverberation of the hollow iron roof of the truck. Had they not been very much on the alert, he would undoubtedly have got one of them, and they realized that they had had a very lucky and very narrow escape. The next morning, they found Brock's bullet embedded in the sand close to a footprint. It could not have missed the lion by more than an inch or two. Mine was nowhere to be found. Thus ended Patterson's first direct encounter with one of the man-eaters. He had survived, but the beasts were still at large, and their reign of terror was far from over. Amidst all this horror, the work of the railway, and specifically of the bridge, had to continue. Patterson, when not hunting lions, was an engineer, and the Tsavo Bridge was his primary responsibility. Before the terror had reached its peak, much foundational work had been accomplished. One of the first tasks was to widen a rock cutting through which the railway ran just before it reached the river. In the initial rush to lay the line, just enough rock had been blasted away to allow an engine to pass, but this was a dangerous bottleneck. Anything projecting from a wagon would be smashed against the jagged rock faces. Patterson set a gang of rock drillers to work and soon had ample room for all traffic to pass unimpeded. Simultaneously, another gang of men was laying the foundations for the permanent girder bridge that was Patterson's main project. While the permanent works were underway, the railway crossed the river on a temporary diversion, a track that dipped down almost to the riverbed and up the other side. A reliable water supply also had to be established, which involved Patterson in the pleasant work of taking levels up the banks of the river, under the cool shade of the palms. The main challenge for the bridge, however, was sinking the foundations for the great stone piers. The two center piers, in particular, caused a great deal of trouble. The river, with its swift current, broke in several times, flooding the works and forcing them to dam it up and pump it dry again before work could be resumed. Then they found they had to sink much deeper than they had expected to reach a solid foundation. The sinking went on, day after day, until Patterson began to despair of finding one at all, and was about to resort to pile driving. At last, to his immense relief, they struck solid rock, a foundation upon which the huge stones could be laid with perfect safety. Another great difficulty was the absence of suitable stone in the neighborhood. The whole district abounded in rock, but it was so intensely hard that it was almost impossible to work, and a bridge built of it would have been prohibitively costly. Patterson spent many weary days trudging through the thorny wilderness, fruitlessly searching for a suitable quarry. He was beginning to think that they would be forced to use iron columns for the piers, when one day he stumbled upon the very thing he was looking for, purely by accident. He and Dr. Brock were out pot hunting for something for the dinner table. Hearing some guinea fowl cackling among the bushes, Patterson made a circuit around them so that Brock could drive them over in his direction. He knelt down on the edge of a deep ravine, crouching among the ferns, waiting for the birds. As he knelt, he felt the ground was very hard under his knee. On examination, he found that the entire bank of the ravine was formed of stone, and it was exactly the kind of workable material for which he had been so fruitlessly searching. His delight at the unexpected discovery was immense, though at first he had grave misgivings about the difficulty of transporting the stone across the intervening country. In the end, he found that the only way to get the material to the bridge site was by laying down a dedicated tram line, or trolley line, right along the ravine. This required them to throw a temporary bridge across the Tsavo, follow the stream down, and recross it again close to the site of the permanent bridge. He set men to work at once to cut down the jungle and prepare a road for the double trolley line. One morning, as they were thus engaged, a little pa, a type of very small antelope, sprang out and found itself suddenly in the midst of a gang of coolies. Terrified and confused, it ran straight at the foreman, who promptly dropped a basket over it and held it fast. Patterson happened to arrive just in time to save the graceful little animal's life and took it back to his camp, where it very soon became a great pet, so tame that it would jump on his table at mealtimes and eat from his hand. The feeding line for the stone was finished in a very short time, and soon trolleys were plying backwards and forwards with loads of stone and sand, for they discovered good quality sand in the bed of the same ravine. It was during this phase of the work that Patterson had to contend with the growing discontent of his workforce. He had sent to the coast for gangs of masons to work and dress the newly discovered stone. The men sent to him were mostly Pathans and were supposed to be expert workmen, but he soon found that many of them had not the faintest notion of stone cutting and were simply ordinary coolies who had posed as masons in order to draw the higher wage of 45 rupees a month instead of the standard 12. On discovering this fraud, he immediately instituted a system of piecework, drawing up a scale of pay that would enable a genuine mason to earn his 45 rupees and a little more if he worked hard, but which would cut down the impostors to about their proper pay as coolies. As is often the case, the impostors were greatly in the majority, and they attempted to intimidate the genuine workers into slowing down, hoping to force Patterson to abandon the piecework system. These tensions frequently erupted into quarrels and fights, and Patterson often had to go down to their camp to quell disturbances. One particularly serious disturbance had a rather amusing sequel. Patterson was sitting at the door of his hut one evening when he heard a great commotion in the masons' camp. A foreman came rushing up, saying the men were all fighting and murdering each other. Patterson ran down and restored order, but found 7 badly injured men stretched out on the ground. As Dr. Brock was away, Patterson had to play the doctor himself, stitching one and bandaging another. There was one man, however, who groaned loudly and held a cloth over his face, as if he were dying. On lifting the covering, he found him to be a certain mason named Karim Bucks, a man well known to him as a prime mischief maker. Patterson examined him carefully, but could discover nothing wrong, so he concluded he must have some internal injury, and told him he would be sent to the hospital at Voi. Scarcely had the man been carried away, groaning grievously, when the head foreman came and informed Patterson that Karim Bucks was not hurt at all, that he was, in fact, the sole cause of the disturbance, and was now pretending to be badly injured to escape the punishment he knew he deserved. On hearing this, Patterson gave instructions that he was not to be sent to Voi. But the drama was not over. About 11 o'clock that night, Patterson was called up again and asked to go down to the masons' camp to see a man who was supposed to be dying. To his amusement, he found it was his friend Karim Bucks, who was now supposedly at death's door. It was perfectly evident that he was only foxing, but when he asked for dawa medicine, Patterson gravely told him that he would give him some very good dawa in the morning. The next day at noon, when Patterson customarily had evildoers brought up for judgment, he asked for Karim Bucks, but was told he was too ill to walk. Patterson ordered him to be carried to his boma, and in a few moments he arrived on his cot, shouldered by 4 coolies who knew quite well he was only shamming. Patterson examined him again, and again the man asked for dawa. "I am going to give you some very effective dawa," Patterson told him, and carefully covered him up, pulling the blanket over his head. He then got a big armful of wood shavings from a nearby carpenter's bench, put them under the bed, and set fire to them. As soon as the sham invalid felt the heat, he peeped over the edge of the blanket. When he saw the smoke and flames leaping up around him, he threw the blanket from him, sprang from the bed exclaiming "Bayman Shaitan," unbelieving devil, and fled like a deer from the boma, pursued by a Sikh sepoy who got in a couple of good whacks with a stout stick before he made his escape. His amused comrades greeted Patterson with shouts of "Shabash, Sahib! Well done, sir!" And he never had any further trouble with Karim Bucks. But the troubles with the workforce were to escalate far beyond simple malingering. As the masons realized that Patterson intended to make each man do a fair day's work for his money, they came to a dark conclusion. It would be best to put him quietly out of the way. They held a secret meeting one night, all being sworn to secrecy. And after a long palaver, it was arranged that Patterson was to be murdered the next day when he made his usual visit to the quarry. His body was to be thrown into the jungle to be devoured by wild beasts, and they would report that he had been killed and eaten by a lion. To this cheerful proposal, every man present at the meeting agreed, and affixed his finger mark to a long strip of paper as a binding token. But within an hour after the meeting had dispersed, one of the conspirators crept into Patterson's camp and gave him warning. Patterson, still not quite believing they were capable of carrying out such a diabolical scheme, determined to go to the quarry in the morning as usual, thinking it might just be a plot to frighten him. The next morning, as he started off along the trolley line to the lonely quarry, his head mason, the loyal Hira Singh, crept cautiously out of the bushes and warned him not to proceed. Patterson laughingly assured him there would be no trouble and continued on his way. On his arrival at the quarry, everything seemed perfectly peaceful. All the men were working away busily, but after a moment or two, he noticed stealthy side glances and felt that there was something in the wind. As soon as he came up to the first gang of workmen, the foreman, a treacherous-looking villain, informed him that the men working further up the ravine had refused to obey his orders, and asked him if he would go and see them. Patterson felt at once that this was a device to lure him into the narrowest part of the ravine, where, with gangs in front of him and behind him, there would be no escape. Still, he thought he would see the adventure through, whatever came of it, so he accompanied the foreman up the gully. When they got to the further gang, the foreman pointed out two men who, he said, were the troublemakers. Patterson noted their names in his pocketbook in his usual manner, and turned to retrace his steps. Immediately, a yell of rage was raised by the whole body of some 60 men, answered by a similar shout from the 100 or so men he had first passed. Both groups, carrying crowbars and flourishing their heavy hammers, then closed in on him in the narrow part of the ravine. He stood still, waiting for them to act. One man rushed at him, seizing both his wrists and shouting that he was going to be hung and shot for me. Patterson easily wrenched his arms free and threw the man from him. But by this time he was closely hemmed in, surrounded by evil and murderous-looking faces. One burly brute, afraid to be the first to deal a blow, hurled the man next to him at Patterson. If he had succeeded in knocking him down, Patterson was certain he would never have gotten up again alive. As it was, he stepped quickly aside, and the man intended to knock him down was himself thrown violently against a rock. This occasioned a moment's confusion, of which Patterson quickly took advantage. He sprang on to the top of the rock, and before they had time to recover, he had started haranguing them in Hindustani. The habit of obedience still held them, and fortunately, they listened to what he had to say. He told them that he knew all about their plot to murder him, and that they could certainly do so if they wished, but that if they did, many of them would assuredly be hanged for it, as the Sarkar, the government, would soon find out the truth and would disbelieve their story that he had been carried off by a lion. He said that he knew it was only 1 or 2 scoundrels among them who had induced them to behave so stupidly, and urged them not to allow themselves to be made fools of in this way. He appealed to their pride as upright Pathans, and asked if they were going to allow themselves to be led away by such men. Finally, he offered a way out. The discontented among them would be allowed to return at once to Mombasa, while if the others resumed work and he heard of no further plotting, he would take no notice of their foolish conduct. He then called upon those who were willing to return to work to hold up their hands, and instantly every hand in the crowd was raised. He felt that for the moment the victory was his. He jumped down from the rock and continued his rounds, as if nothing had happened, measuring a stone here and there and commenting on the work done. They were still in a very uncertain and sullen mood, however, and not at all to be relied upon, so it was with feelings of great relief that an hour later he made his way back, safe and sound, to Tsavo. The danger was not yet past. Scarcely had he turned his back to go home when the mutiny broke out again. Another meeting was held, and a fresh plot was made to murder him during the night. Of this he was soon informed by his timekeeper, who also told him that he was afraid to go out and call the roll, as the men had threatened to kill him also. At this further outrage, Patterson lost no time in telegraphing for the railway police, and also to the district officer, Mr. Whitehead, who immediately marched his men 25 miles by road to his assistance. Patterson had no doubt that Whitehead's prompt action alone saved him from being attacked that very night. A few days later, the railway police arrived and arrested the ringleaders in the mutiny. They were taken to Mombasa, tried, and sentenced to various terms of imprisonment in the chain gangs. Patterson was never again troubled with mutinous workmen. But his troubles were far from over. The human threat had been neutralized, but the demonic, four-legged threat was about to return with a vengeance, plunging the district into its darkest and most desperate days. The reign of terror was about to begin in earnest. Patterson now had time to focus on his ingenious lion trap. He had constructed it during a lull in the attacks, a heavy cage of wooden sleepers and iron rails, divided into two compartments, one for live human bait and one for the lion. A sliding door was rigged to a spring mechanism on the floor. When the lion stepped on it, the door would slam shut, trapping it inside. The bait, in their section, would be perfectly safe, separated from the beast by a partition of iron bars. The whole contraption was covered with a tent to disguise it, and surrounded by a strong boma. For the first few nights, Patterson baited the trap himself, but the only results were sleepless, uncomfortable nights and a great many mosquito bites. For some months, the lions left Tsavo alone, though reports of their depredations in other quarters continued to trickle in. At Tsavo, a feeling of security began to return. The coolies resumed their usual habits, and some even began sleeping outside their tents again for the sake of coolness. This foolish confidence was suddenly and brutally shattered. One dark night, the familiar terror, stricken cries and screams once more woke the camps. The demons had returned. One of the brutes was discovered forcing its way through a boma. The alarm was given, and men hurled sticks, stones, and firebrands at the intruder, but it was no use. The lion burst into the midst of a terrified group sleeping in the open, seized an unfortunate wretch, and dragged him off through the thick thorn fence. It was joined outside by the second lion, and so daring had the two brutes become that they did not even bother to carry their victim away, but devoured him within 30 yards of the tent where he had been seized, ignoring the shots fired in their direction by the jemadar of the gang. Patterson sat up that night over the few scattered remains of the body, but the lions did not return. Instead, he learned the next morning that they had attacked another camp about 2 miles away and had been successful in obtaining a victim there too. How they continually forced their way through the thick thorn, bomas, without making a sound, remained a mystery to him. He sat up every night for over a week near likely camps, but all in vain. The lions always seemed to know where he was, avoiding his vigil and taking a man from some other place without ever giving him a chance of a shot. The strain of these nightly watches was immense. Patterson wrote that in his whole life he had never experienced anything more nerve-shaking than to hear the deep roars of these dreadful monsters growing gradually nearer and nearer, and to know that some one or other of them was doomed to be their victim before morning dawned. Once the lions reached the vicinity of the camps, the roars would completely cease, and they knew the silent, deadly stalk had begun. Shouts would then pass from camp to camp. Kabar dar, bayon, shaitan ata. Beware, brothers, the devil is coming. But the warning cries would prove of no avail, and sooner or later, agonizing shrieks would break the silence, and another man would be missing from roll call the next morning. He was at his wits' end to know what to do. The Indians were more than ever confirmed in their belief that the lions were really evil spirits, proof against mortal weapons. And indeed, they did seem to bear charmed lives. He had many helpers during this time. Several officers, civil, naval, and military, came up from the coast to Tsavo and sat up night after night in order to get a shot at the daring foes, but all met with the same lack of success. He had a vivid recollection of one particular night when the brutes seized a man from the railway station and brought him close to Patterson's own camp to devour. He could plainly hear them crunching the man's bones, and the sound of their dreadful purring filled the air and rang in his ears for days afterwards. The terrible thing was to feel so helpless it was useless to go out, as the poor fellow was already dead, and it was so pitch dark as to make it impossible to see anything. Some 6 workmen who lived in a small enclosure close to his became so terrified on hearing the lions at their meal that they shouted and implored him to allow them to come inside his boma, which he willingly did. Soon afterwards, he remembered that one man had been lying ill in their camp, and on making inquiry, he found that they had callously left him behind alone. Patterson immediately took some men with him to bring the sick man to his boma, but on entering his tent, he saw by the light of the lantern that the poor fellow was beyond need of safety. He had died of shock at being deserted by his companions. From this time, matters gradually became worse and worse. Hitherto, as a rule, only one of the man-eaters had made the attack and had done the foraging, while the other waited outside in the bush. But now they began to change their tactics, entering the bomas together and each seizing a victim. In this way, 2 Swahili porters were killed during the last week of November. One was immediately carried off and devoured. The other was heard moaning for a long time, and when his terrified companions at last summoned up sufficient courage to go to his assistance, they found him stuck fast in the bushes of the boma, through which, for once, the lion had apparently been unable to drag him. He was still alive when Patterson saw him the next morning, but so terribly mauled that he died before he could be got to the hospital. A few days later, on December 1st, the 2 brutes made a most ferocious attack on the largest camp in the section, which for safety's sake was situated within a stone's throw of Tsavo station. Suddenly, in the dead of night, the 2 man-eaters burst in among the terrified workmen. Even from his boma, some distance away, Patterson could plainly hear the panic-stricken shrieking of the coolies, followed by cries of, "They've taken him! They've taken him!" as the brutes carried off their unfortunate victim and began their horrible feast close beside the camp. The inspector, a Mr. Dalgairns, fired over 50 shots in the direction in which he heard the lions, but they were not to be frightened and calmly lay there until their meal was finished. The next morning, they set out to follow the brutes, but found only the grisly remains of the unfortunate coolie. It was this attack that finally broke the men's spirit. The bravest men in the world would not stand constant terrors of this sort indefinitely, much less the ordinary Indian coolie. That very afternoon, Patterson found that the men had all struck work and were waiting to speak to him. They flocked to his boma in a body and stated that they would not remain at Tsavo any longer for anything or anybody. They had come from India on an agreement to work for the government, not to supply food for either lions or devils. No sooner had they delivered this ultimatum than a regular stampede took place. Some hundreds of them stopped the first passing train by throwing themselves on the rails in front of the engine, and then, swarming onto the trucks and throwing in their possessions anyhow, they fled from the accursed spot. After this, the railway works were completely stopped. For the next 3 weeks, practically nothing was done but build lion-proof huts for those few workmen who had had sufficient courage to remain. It was a strange and amusing sight to see these shelters perched on top of water, tanks, roofs, and girders, anywhere for safety. Some even went so far as to dig pits inside their tents, into which they descended at night, covering the top over with heavy logs of wood. Every good-sized tree in the camp had as many beds lashed to it as its branches would bear, and sometimes more. Patterson recalled one night when the camp was attacked, so many men swarmed onto one particular tree that it came down with a crash, hurling its terror. Stricken load of shrieking coolies close to the very lions they were trying to avoid. Fortunately for them, a victim had already been secured, and the brutes were too busy devouring him to pay attention to anything else. It was into this atmosphere of utter terror and defeat that the district officer, Mr. Whitehead, arrived on the evening of December 2nd to lend his assistance. His train was late, and it was quite dark when he arrived at Tsavo station. In fact, my own boy, sent to meet him, had rushed back in terror, claiming an enormous lion was standing on the station platform, a story that turned out to be true, as both the station, master and signalman, had been forced to lock themselves inside the station building to escape it. Whitehead started to walk from the station to Patterson's camp through a small, gloomy cutting, accompanied by his sergeant of Askaris, Abdullah, who carried a lighted lamp. All went well until they were about halfway through, when one of the lions suddenly jumped down upon them from the high bank, knocking Whitehead over like a 9-pin and tearing his back with its claws. Fortunately, he had his carbine with him and instantly fired. The flash and the loud report must have dazed the lion for a second, enabling Whitehead to disengage himself. But the next instant the brute pounced like lightning on the unfortunate Abdullah, with whom he had once made off. All that the poor fellow could say was, "Eh, Bwana Simba, oh, master, a lion." As the lion was dragging him over the bank, Whitehead fired again, but without effect, and the brute quickly disappeared into the darkness with his prey. It was, of course, this unfortunate man whom Patterson had heard the lions devouring during his vigil in the sleeper crib that same night. The next day, the forces arrayed against the lions were further strengthened. Mr. Farquhar, the superintendent of police, arrived from the coast with a score of sepoys, and several other officials also came up on leave to join in the chase. The most elaborate precautions were taken. Farquhar's men were posted on the most convenient trees near every camp, and each of the visiting officials guarded a likely spot in the same way, with Whitehead sharing. Patterson's post inside the crib on the girder, and, in spite of some chaff from the others, Patterson's lion trap was put in thorough working order, and 2 of the sepoys were installed as bait. Their preparations were complete by nightfall, and they all took up their appointed positions. Nothing happened until about 9 o'clock, when, to Patterson's great satisfaction, the intense stillness was suddenly broken by the noise of the door of the trap clattering down. At last, he thought, one at least of the brutes is done for. But the sequel was an ignominious one. The bait sepoys had been given strict orders to shoot at once if a lion should enter the trap, but instead of doing so, they were so terrified, when he rushed in and began to lash himself madly against the bars of the cage, that they completely lost their heads and were actually too unnerved to fire. Not until Mr. Farquhar, whose post was close by, shouted at them and cheered them on, did they at all recover themselves. Then, when at last they did begin to fire, they fired with a vengeance. Anywhere, anyhow. Their bullets came whizzing all around Patterson and Whitehead. Altogether, they fired over a score of shots, and in the end succeeded only in blowing away one of the bars of the door, thus allowing their prize to make good his escape. How they failed to kill him several times over was, and always would be, a complete mystery to Patterson, as they could have put the muzzles of their rifles absolutely touching his body. The next day's hunt for the wounded beast proved fruitless, and soon Farquhar and the others had to depart, leaving Patterson once again alone to face the demons of Tsavo. The situation seemed more hopeless than ever. He had tried everything: vigils, tracking, traps, and organized hunts, and all had failed. The lions were still masters of Tsavo, and the great railway project remained paralyzed by their reign of terror. The great hunt had ended in failure. Mr. Farquhar and his sepoys had returned to the coast. The visiting officers had departed, and Mr. Whitehead, his back still bearing the fresh claw marks of his terrifying encounter, had left for his own district. Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Patterson was once again left alone at Tsavo, alone with the victorious Man-Eaters. The railway works were at a complete standstill, paralyzed by a terror so profound that hundreds of men had fled for their lives. The few who remained were huddled in their makeshift shelters, perched on water tanks or in the high branches of trees, their nights filled with the dread of what the darkness might bring. The elaborate trap had failed, its door blasted open by the panicked, clumsy hands of the men who were supposed to be its operators. The lions had been shot at, tracked, and pursued by a small army of hunters, yet they remained unscathed, more audacious than ever. It seemed as though the spirits of the Nika themselves had risen up against the iron snake of the railway, and that nothing mortal could stand against them. Patterson was a man at the end of his resources, facing an enemy that seemed to possess a charmed and demonic life. But the darkest hour, as it is often said, is just before the dawn. Patterson's moment of reckoning was approaching, though it would come through yet more failure, terror, and a night of such nerve-shattering suspense that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. A day or two after the departure of his allies, on the morning of December 9, 1898, as Patterson was leaving his fortified boma soon after dawn, he saw a Swahili worker running frantically towards him. The man was shouting, "Simba, Simba! Lion, lion!" And every now and again he would cast a terrified look behind him as he ran. On questioning him, Patterson found that the lions had tried to snatch a man from the camp by the river, but being foiled in this, they had instead seized and killed one of the donkeys from the camp. At that very moment, the man gasped. The 2 beasts were busy devouring their kill not far off. Was it? This was the chance. A thrill of renewed determination shot through Patterson. Forgetting his exhaustion and the long string of failures, he rushed for the heavy rifle which Farquhar had kindly left with him for just such an opportunity. Led by the Swahili guide, he began to stalk the lions with the utmost care, devoutly hoping that they were confining their attention strictly to their meal. He was getting on splendidly, moving from bush to bush, a phantom in the morning light. He could just make out the tawny outline of one of them through the dense foliage, when suddenly his guide, in his own nervous excitement, made a fatal error. He trod on a rotten branch, and it snapped with a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet air. The wily beast heard the noise instantly. A low, defiant growl came from the bush, and in a moment the lion had disappeared into a patch of even thicker jungle close by. Patterson's heart sank. Desperation seized him. The thought of the lion escaping him once again, after coming so close, was unbearable. But in that moment of despair, a daring and desperate plan formed in his mind. He crept hurriedly back to the camp and summoned every available workman. He told them to bring all the tom-toms, tin cans, and any other noisy instrument of any kind that could possibly be found. He was going to turn the tables. He was going to become the master of the hunt. As quickly as possible, he posted the men in a half-circle around the thicket where the lion was concealed. He gave the head jemadar instructions to start a simultaneous and terrific beating of the tom-toms and cans as soon as he judged that Patterson had had time to get around to the other side. Patterson then crept around by himself and soon found a good position, one which the lion was most likely to retreat past, as it was in the middle of a broad animal path leading straight from the place where it was concealed. He lay down behind a small anthill, his rifle ready, and waited, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Very soon, he heard a tremendous din being raised by the advancing line of coolies. It was a cacophony of banging tins and booming drums, a sound designed to terrify any creature. And it worked. Almost immediately, to Patterson's intense and profound joy, out into the open path stepped a huge, maneless lion. It was the first occasion during all these trying months upon which he had had a fair, open chance at one of these brutes, and his satisfaction at the prospect of finally bagging him was unbounded. Slowly, the great beast advanced along the path, stopping every few seconds to look back at the terrifying noise that pursued him. Patterson was only partially concealed from view, and if the lion's attention had not been so fully occupied by the clamor behind him, he must surely have been observed. As it was, the lion was oblivious to his presence. Patterson let him approach to within about 15 yards of where he lay. He could see the powerful muscles ripple under the tawny skin. He could see the twitching of its tail. He slowly, carefully, raised the heavy rifle and covered the lion's brain with his sights. The moment he moved to do this, the lion caught sight of him. The great beast seemed utterly astonished at his sudden appearance. It stuck its forefeet into the ground, threw itself back on its haunches, and let out a savage, guttural growl. As Patterson looked down the barrel of his rifle, he felt a surge of triumph. At last he had him, absolutely at his mercy. But, as he would later write, one should never trust an untried weapon. He pulled the trigger, and to his utter horror, he heard only the dull, metallic snap that tells the terrible tale of a misfire. Worse was to follow. He was so taken aback, so completely disconcerted by this untoward and cruel accident, that he entirely forgot that the rifle had a second barrel. He lowered the weapon from his shoulder, his mind racing, with the intention of trying to reload if he should be given the time. But the lion, it seemed, was as distracted as he was. Instead of springing upon the now defenseless man, as might have been expected, the great beast was so panicked by the terrific din and uproar of the coolies behind him that he bounded aside, back into the jungle. As the lion jumped, Patterson's wits returned to him. He threw the rifle back to his shoulder and let him have the left barrel. An answering, angry growl told him that he had been hit, but nevertheless the lion had succeeded once more in getting clear away. Patterson tracked him for some little distance, but he eventually lost the trail in a rocky patch of ground. The disappointment was beyond bitter. He stood there, the sound of the beaters dying away, and anathematized the hour in which he had relied on a borrowed weapon. He abused the owner, the maker, and the rifle itself with a fine impartiality. On extracting the unexploded cartridge, he found that the firing pin had not struck the cap with enough force. It was only slightly dented. The whole fault did indeed lie with the rifle. But that was small consolation. To the Indian workers, his continued ill luck was more than just bad fortune. It was confirmation. It was proof that these lions were indeed evil spirits, immune to mortal weapons. And certainly, they did seem to bear charmed lives. After this dismal failure, there was nothing to do but return to camp. Before doing so, however, Patterson proceeded to view the dead donkey. He found that the lions had only slightly devoured it at the quarters, a curious fact, he noted, as lions almost always begin at the tail of their prey and eat upwards towards the head. As their meal had thus been interrupted at the very beginning, he felt quite certain that one or other of the brutes would return to the carcass at nightfall to finish their meal. And so, a new plan began to form, a plan that would lead to a night of almost unbearable terror. As there was no tree of any kind close at hand, he had a machine, or staging, erected some 10 feet away from the donkey's body. This machine was a crude and flimsy affair, about 12 feet high, composed of 4 poles stuck into the ground and inclined towards each other at the top, where a simple wooden plank was lashed to serve as a seat. It was not built for comfort, nor was it built to withstand a direct assault. Furthermore, as the nights were still pitch dark, he had the donkey's carcass secured by strong wires to a neighboring stump, so that the lions might not be able to drag it away into the bush before he could get a shot at them. At sundown, therefore, he took up his position on his airy perch. Much to the disgust of his faithful gun-bearer Mahina, he decided to go alone. He would gladly have taken the man with him, but Mahina had a bad cough, and Patterson was afraid that any involuntary noise or movement might spoil everything. As darkness fell, an extraordinary stillness descended upon the jungle. The silence of an African wilderness on a dark night, as Patterson later wrote, needs to be experienced to be realized. It is most impressive, especially when one is absolutely alone and isolated from one's fellow creatures. The solitude and stillness and the grim purpose of his vigil all had their effect on him. From a condition of strained expectancy, he gradually fell into a dreamy, almost meditative mood, which harmonized well with his strange surroundings. Suddenly, he was startled out of his reverie by the sharp snapping of a twig. He strained his ears for a further sound and fancied he could hear the rustling of a large body forcing its way through the bush. The man-eater, he thought to himself. Surely tonight my luck will change, and I shall bag one of the brutes. Profound silence again succeeded. He sat on his eyrie like a statue, every nerve tense with excitement. Very soon, however, all doubt as to the presence of the lion was dispelled. A deep, long-drawn sigh, the sure sign of hunger, came up from the bushes, and the rustling commenced again as the beast cautiously advanced. In a moment or two, there was a sudden stop, followed by an angry growl. It told him that his presence had been noticed. His heart sank. He began to fear that disappointment awaited him once more. But no, matters quickly took an unexpected and terrifying turn. The hunter had become the hunted. Instead of either making off or coming for the bait that had been prepared for him, the lion began stealthily to stalk Patterson himself. For about 2 hours, the great beast horrified him by slowly, patiently, creeping round and round his crazy structure, gradually edging its way nearer and nearer. Every moment, Patterson expected him to rush it, and he knew full well that the staging had not been constructed with an eye to such a possibility. If one of the rather flimsy poles should break, or if the lion could manage to spring the 12 feet which separated him from the ground, the thought was scarcely a pleasant one. He began to feel distinctly creepy, and heartily repented his folly in having placed himself in such an exposed and dangerous position. He kept perfectly still, however, hardly daring even to blink his eyes, but the long-continued strain was telling on his nerves, and his feelings, he later admitted, could be better imagined than described. About midnight, as he sat there rigid with tension, something suddenly came out of the blackness and went flop, striking him on the back of the head. For a moment, he was so terrified that he nearly fell off the plank. He thought the lion had sprung on him from behind. Regaining his senses in a second or two, he realized that he had been hit by nothing more formidable than an owl, which had doubtless mistaken him for the branch of a tree. It was not a very alarming thing to happen in ordinary circumstances, he admitted, but coming at the time it did, it almost paralyzed him. The involuntary start which he could not help giving was immediately answered by a sinister growl from below. After this, he again kept as still as he could, though he was now absolutely trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. In a short while, he heard the lion begin to creep stealthily towards him again. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was profound, but against the whitish undergrowth, he could barely make out its form as it crouched low to the ground. He saw enough for his purpose, and before the beast could come any nearer, he took careful aim at the shadowy shape and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was at once followed by a most terrific, blood-curdling roar, and then he could hear the great animal leaping about in all directions. He was no longer able to see him, as his first bound had taken him into the thick bush. But to make assurance doubly sure, he kept blazing away in the direction in which he heard the beast plunging about. At length, there came a series of mighty groans, which gradually subsided into deep, shuddering sighs, and finally ceased altogether. He felt convinced, with a wave of immense relief, that one of the devils who had so long harried them would trouble them no more. As soon as he ceased firing, a tumult of inquiring voices was borne across the dark jungle from the men in the camp, about a quarter of a mile away. He shouted back that he was safe and sound, and that one of the lions was dead. In response, such a mighty cheer went up from all the camps as must have astonished the denizens of the jungle for miles around. Shortly, he saw scores of lights twinkling through the bushes. Every man in the camp had turned out, and with tom-toms beating and horns blowing, they came running to the scene. They surrounded his eyrie, and to his amazement, they prostrated themselves on the ground before him, saluting him with cries of Mubarak, Mubarak, which he believed meant Blessed One or Savior. All the same, he refused to allow any search to be made that night for the body of the lion, just in case its companion might be close by. Besides, it was still possible that the beast might be still alive, and capable of making one last desperate spring. Accordingly, they all returned in triumph to the camp, where great rejoicings were kept up for the remainder of the night, the Swahili and other African natives celebrating the occasion by an especially wild and savage dance. For his part, Patterson anxiously awaited the dawn. Even before it was thoroughly light, he was on his way to the eventful spot, as he could not completely persuade himself that even yet the devil might not have eluded him in some uncanny and mysterious way. Happily, his fears proved groundless. His luck, after playing him so many exasperating tricks, had really turned at last. He had scarcely traced the blood for more than a few paces when, on rounding a bush, he was startled to see a huge lion right in front of him, seemingly alive and crouching for a spring. On looking closer, however, he satisfied himself that he was really and truly stone dead. At this, his followers crowded round, laughed and danced and shouted with joy like children, and bore him in triumph shoulder-high round the dead body of their enemy. The prize was indeed one to be proud of. His length from tip of nose to tip of tail was 9 feet 8 inches. He stood 3 feet 9 inches high, and it took 8 men to carry him back to camp. The only blemish on his magnificent hide was that it was much scored by the boma thorns through which he had so often forced his way in carrying off his victims. Patterson examined the body and found that 2 bullets had taken effect, one close behind the left shoulder, which had evidently penetrated the heart, and the other in the off-hind leg. The news of the death of one of the notorious man-eaters soon spread far and wide over the country. Telegrams of congratulation came pouring in, and scores of people flocked from up and down the railway to see the skin for themselves. One of the demons was dead, and a wave of relief swept through Tsavo. But it must not be imagined that their troubles were at an end. His companion was still at large, and very soon he began to make them unpleasantly aware of the fact. The final reckoning was yet to come. Only a few nights elapsed before the remaining man-eater made an attempt to get at the permanent way inspector, climbing up the steps of his bungalow and prowling around the veranda. The inspector, hearing the noise and thinking it was just a drunken coolie, shouted angrily, "Go away!" But fortunately for him, he did not attempt to come out or to open the door. Thus disappointed in his attempt to obtain a meal of human flesh, the lion seized a couple of the inspector's goats and devoured them there and then. On hearing of this, Patterson determined to sit up the next night near the inspector's bungalow. Fortunately, there was a vacant iron shanty close at hand, with a convenient loophole in it for firing from. Outside this, he placed 3 full-grown goats as bait, tying them to a half-length of rail, weighing about 250 pounds. The night passed uneventfully until just before daybreak, when at last the lion turned up, pounced on one of the goats, and made off with it, at the same time dragging away the other 2, rail and all. Patterson fired several shots in his direction, but it was pitch dark and quite impossible to see anything, so he only succeeded in hitting one of the other goats. He often longed for a flashlight on such occasions. The next morning, he started off in pursuit, joined by some others from the camp. They found that the trail of the goats and the heavy rail was easily followed, and they soon came up about a quarter of a mile away to where the lion was still busy at his meal. He was concealed in some thick bush and growled angrily on hearing their approach. Finally, as they got closer, he suddenly made a charge, rushing through the bushes at a great pace. In an instant, every man of the party scrambled hastily up the nearest tree, with the exception of one of Patterson's assistants, a Mr. Winkler, who stood steadily by him throughout. The brute, however, did not press his charge home, and on throwing stones into the bushes where they had last seen him, they guessed by the silence that he had slunk off. They advanced, cautiously, and discovered that he had indeed escaped them, leaving 2 of the goats scarcely touched. Thinking that in all probability the lion would return as usual to finish his meal, Patterson had a very strong scaffolding, put up a few feet away from the dead goats, and took up his position on it before dark. On this occasion, he brought his gun, bearer, Mahina, to take a turn at watching, as he was by this time worn out for want of sleep. He was just dozing off comfortably when suddenly he felt his arm seized, and on looking up, saw Mahina pointing in the direction of the goats. "Sure, lion," was all he whispered. Patterson grasped his double-barreled smooth bore, which he had charged with slug, and waited patiently. In a few moments, he was rewarded. As he watched the spot where he expected the lion to appear, there was a rustling among the bushes, and he saw the great beast stealthily emerge into the open and pass almost directly beneath them. He fired both barrels practically together into its shoulder, and to his joy he could see it go down under the force of the blow. Quickly, he reached for his magazine rifle, but before he could use it, the lion was out of sight among the bushes, and he had to fire after him quite at random. Nevertheless, he was confident of getting him in the morning. As soon as it was light, he set out. For over a mile, there was no difficulty in following the blood trail, and as the lion had rested several times, he felt sure that it had been badly wounded. In the end, however, his hunt proved fruitless, for after a time the traces of blood ceased and the surface of the ground became rocky, so he was no longer able to follow the spoor. About this time, a distinguished visitor, Sir Guilford Molesworth, the consulting engineer for the Uganda Railway, passed through Tsavo on a tour of inspection. He thoroughly sympathized with them in all the trials they had endured from the man-eaters, and was delighted that one at least was dead. When he asked Patterson if he expected to get the second lion soon, he well remembered Sir Guilford's doubting smile as he rather too confidently asserted that he hoped to bag him also in the course of a few days. As it happened, there was no sign of their enemy for about 10 days after this, and they began to hope that he had died of his wounds in the bush. All the same, they still took every precaution at night, and it was fortunate that they did so. For on the night of December 27th, Patterson was suddenly aroused by terrified shouts from his trolleymen, who slept in a tree close outside his boma. A lion was trying to get at them. It would have been madness to have gone out, as the moon was hidden by dense clouds, and it was absolutely impossible to see anything more than a yard in front of one. So all he could do was to fire off a few rounds just to frighten the brute away. This apparently had the desired effect, for the men were not further molested that night. But the man-eater had evidently prowled about for some time, for they found in the morning that he had gone right into every one of their empty tents, and around the base of the tree was a regular ring of his footmarks. The following evening, Patterson took up his position in this same tree, in the hope that the lion would make another attempt. The night began badly. While climbing up to his perch, he very nearly put his hand on a venomous snake which was lying coiled round one of the branches. He came down again very quickly, and one of his men managed to dispatch it with a long pole. Fortunately, the night was clear and cloudless, and the moon made everything almost as bright as day. He kept watch until about 2 in the morning, when he roused Mahina to take his turn. For about an hour, he slept peacefully with his back to the tree, and then woke suddenly with an uncanny feeling that something was wrong. Mahina, however, was on the alert and had seen nothing, and although Patterson looked carefully around on all sides, he too could discover nothing unusual. Only half satisfied, he was about to lie back again when he fancied he saw something move a little way off among the low bushes. On gazing intently at the spot for a few seconds, he found he was not mistaken. It was the man-eater, cautiously stalking them. The ground was fairly open around their tree, with only a small bush every here and there, and from their high position, it was a most fascinating sight to watch this great brute stealing stealthily round them, taking advantage of every bit of cover as he came. His skill showed that he was an old hand at the terrible game of man-hunting, so Patterson determined to run no undue risk of losing him this time. He accordingly waited until the lion got quite close, about 20 yards away, and then fired his .303 at its chest. He heard the bullet strike, but unfortunately, it had no knockdown effect, for with a fierce growl, the lion turned and made off with great long bounds. Before he disappeared from sight, however, Patterson managed to have 3 more shots at him from the magazine rifle, and another growl told him that the last of these had also taken effect. They awaited daylight with impatience, and at the first glimmer of dawn, they set out to hunt him down. Patterson took a native tracker with him so that he was free to keep a good lookout, while Mahina followed immediately behind with a Martini carbine. Splashes of blood were plentiful, and they were able to get along quickly. They had not proceeded more than a quarter of a mile through the jungle, when suddenly a fierce warning growl was heard right in front of them. Looking cautiously through the bushes, Patterson could see the man-eater glaring out in their direction, showing his tusks in an angry snarl. He at once took careful aim and fired. Instantly, the lion sprang out and made a most determined charge straight down on them. Patterson fired again and knocked him over, but in a second he was up once more and coming for him as fast as he could in his crippled condition. A third shot had no apparent effect, so he put out his hand for the Martini, hoping to stop him with it. To his dismay, however, it was not there. The terror of the sudden charge had proved too much for Mahina, and both he and the carbine were by this time well on their way up a tree. In the circumstances, there was nothing to do but follow suit, which Patterson did without loss of time. But for the fact that one of his shots had broken a hind leg, the brute would most certainly have had him. Even as it was, he had barely time to swing himself up out of its reach before it arrived at the foot of the tree. When the lion found he was too late, he started to limp back to the thicket, but by this time Patterson had seized the carbine from Mahina, and the first shot he fired from it seemed to give him his quietus, for he fell over and lay motionless. Rather foolishly, Patterson at once scrambled down from the tree and walked up towards him. To his surprise and no little alarm, the lion jumped up and attempted another charge. This time, however, a Martini bullet in the chest and another in the head finished him for good and all. He dropped in his tracks not 5 yards away from Patterson and died gamely, biting savagely at a branch which had fallen to the ground. By this time, all the workmen in camp, attracted by the sound of the firing, had arrived on the scene, and so great was their resentment against the brute who had killed such numbers of their comrades that it was only with the greatest difficulty, too, that Patterson could restrain them from tearing the dead body to pieces. Eventually, amid the wild rejoicings of the natives and coolies, he had the lion carried to his boma. On examination, they found no less than 6 bullet holes in the body. He measured 9 feet 6 inches from tip of nose to tip of tail, and stood 3 feet 11.5 inches high. Like his companion, his skin was disfigured by being deeply scored all over by the boma thorns. The news of the death of the second devil soon spread far and wide. The reign of terror at Tsavo was finally and truly over. The workers who had fled in panic came flocking back. Work on the Great Bridge was resumed, and a period of peace and relative normality descended upon the once tormented district. The 2 lions that had held an Empire's project hostage, that had devoured 28 Indian coolies and scores of unfortunate African natives, were dead. Their legend, however, was just beginning. It would be told in the halls of Parliament, written about in newspapers across the world. With the death of the 2 man-eaters, passed down for generations as the most terrifying and remarkable lion story ever recorded. The oppressive atmosphere of fear, which had hung like a physical shroud over the camps for 9 long months, finally lifted. The nightly chorus of terrified screams was replaced by the sounds of song and laughter. The workers, who had fled in a great stampede, came flocking back, their confidence restored, their faces lit with relief, and a newfound reverence for the man they now called their savior. The work on the railway, so violently interrupted, was resumed with a new energy and vigor. The primary mission, the great bridge over the Tsavo, could at last be completed. The project now moved forward at a brisk pace. The great stone piers and abutments began to rise steadily from the riverbed. As they grew in height, Patterson faced a new engineering challenge. He had to find a way to lift the massive, heavy stones into their positions, but he possessed no modern cranes for this purpose. In the heart of the African wilderness, ingenuity was a greater asset than equipment. He set his mind to the problem, and devised a solution from the very materials of the railway itself. He took a couple of 30-foot steel rails and bolted them together at the top, fixing the other ends about 10 feet apart into a large, heavy block of wood. This created a giant improvised shears. With this simple but effective contrivance, through a careful manipulation of ropes and pulleys, the heavy stones were swung into position quickly and without difficulty. In a remarkably short time, the masonry of the bridge, a monument of stone hewn from the local wilderness, was complete. The next and final task was to span the 60-foot gaps between the piers with the heavy iron girders that had been brought up from the coast on railway trucks. This presented an even greater challenge. With neither proper winches nor sufficient blocks and tackle to haul these immense structures across the spans, Patterson was once again forced to innovate. He ordered the construction of temporary piers in the middle of each span, great cribs built up layer by layer out of wooden sleepers. When these were ready, huge wooden beams were stretched across from the stone piers to the temporary cribs, and rails were laid upon them, creating a makeshift bridge at the same level as the main one. The process was methodical and filled with tension. A heavy girder, still on the railway trucks it had arrived on, was carefully run out over the temporary structure until it was in the exact place where it was needed. Then, using an array of powerful jacks, the girder was slowly and painstakingly lifted up from the trucks. The now empty trucks were hauled away, and the temporary wooden bridge beneath the girder was carefully dismantled, piece by piece. Finally, with the great iron beam suspended in mid-air on the jacks, it was lowered, inch by inch, gently and precisely into its final resting place upon the stone piers. When the last girder was thus successfully placed, a great cheer went up from the workmen. No time was lost in linking up the permanent way, and very soon Patterson had the immense satisfaction of seeing the first train steam triumphantly across the finished work. The Tsavo Bridge was complete, and as if the land itself wanted to test his creation, a dramatic proof of its strength came just a day or two later. A tremendous rainstorm broke over the country. The river started to rise with alarming rapidity, soon flooding its banks and transforming from a clear, swift stream into a raging, murky torrent, tearing up trees by the roots and whirling them along like straws. Steadily higher and higher rose the flood. Patterson stood on his new bridge, watching with a professional's expectant eye for the two temporary trolley bridges, the ones they had built further up the river to bring stone and sand from the quarry, to give way before the ever-rising volume of water. He had not long to wait. Soon he caught sight of a solid mass of palm stems and railway sleepers, sweeping with almost irresistible force around a bend in the river. It was the debris of the trolley crossing furthest up the stream. On it came, borne on an additional bank of stormy-looking water. He held his breath for a moment as it leaped at the second frail structure. There was a dull thud and a rending and riving of timbers, and then the flood rolled on towards him, leaving not a vestige of the two temporary bridges behind it. The impact had been so great that the steel rails were twisted around the broken tree trunks, as if they had been nothing more than ordinary wire. This double tier of wreckage now swept forward and hurled itself with a sullen plunge against the sharp cutwaters of his stone piers. The shock was immense, but to his deep and abiding satisfaction, the bridge took it without a tremor. The great mass of wreckage swirled harmlessly through the wide spans and quickly disappeared on its journey to the ocean. He confessed later that he witnessed the whole occurrence with a thrill of pride. His work had been tested by the full fury of the river, and it had held. But with the man-eaters gone, the lesser demons of the jungle took their turn to harass the camps at Tsavo. When the settlement was not being attacked by lions, it was visited by leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, and wild cats. These animals did a great deal of damage to the herds of sheep and goats, which were kept to supply the commissariat, and there was always great rejoicing when a capture was made in one of the many traps that were laid for them. Leopards, especially, proved to be most wantonly destructive. Patterson harbored a particular animosity towards them, ever since one night when one of the spotted killers single-handedly destroyed an entire herd of his. He had at the time a flock of about 30 sheep and goats which he kept for food and milk, and which were secured at sundown in a grass hut at one corner of his boma. One particularly dark night, the camp was startled by a tremendous commotion in this shed. It was before the man-eaters were killed, so no one dared stir out to investigate the cause of the disturbance. Patterson, naturally thinking that the intruder was one of the demons, fired several shots from his own hut in the direction of the shed, hoping to frighten the beast away. In spite of the gunfire, it was some time before the noise died down and everything became still again. As soon as it was dawn, he went to the shed to see what had happened, and there, to his intense anger, he found every single one of his sheep and goats lying stretched dead on the ground, each with its throat bitten through. A hole had been made through the frail wall of the shed, and from this and from the tracks all around, he saw that the author of the wholesale slaughter had been a leopard. The beast had not eaten a single one of the flock, but had killed them all, it seemed, out of a pure and vicious love of destruction. Hoping that the killer would return the next night to make a meal, Patterson determined to have his revenge. He left the carcasses exactly as they lay. He had a very powerful steel trap, like an enormous rat trap, quite strong enough to hold a leopard if it should put its foot in it. He placed this in the opening into the shed and secured it by a stout chain to a long stake driven into the ground outside. Darkness found everyone in his boma on the alert, listening anxiously to hear the noise the leopard would make the moment it was caught. They were not disappointed. About midnight, they heard the sharp click of the powerful spring, followed immediately by frantic, furious roaring and plunging. Patterson had been sitting all evening with his rifle by his side and a lantern lighted, so he immediately rushed out, followed by the chowkidar watchman carrying the lamp. As they approached the shed, the trapped leopard made a frantic spring in their direction as far as the chain would allow him. This so frightened the chowkidar that he dropped the lamp and fled in terror, leaving Patterson in utter darkness. The night was as black as the previous one, and he could see absolutely nothing. But he knew the general direction in which to fire and accordingly emptied his magazine at the beast. As far as he could make out, the leopard kept dodging in and out through the broken wall of the goat house. But in a short time his shots evidently told, as the struggle ceased and all was still. He called out that the animal was dead, and at once everyone in the boma turned out, bringing all the lanterns in the place. With the others came his Indian overseer, who shouted that he too wanted revenge, as some of the goats had belonged to him. Whereupon he leveled his revolver at the dead leopard, and shutting his eyes tightly, fired 4 shots in rapid succession. Naturally, not one of these touched the beast, but they caused considerable consternation amongst the onlookers, who scattered rapidly to right and left. The next morning, a party of starving Wakamba tribesmen happened to be passing just as Patterson was about to skin the leopard. They asked by means of signs to be allowed to do the job for him, and then to take the meat. Patterson, of course, assented, and in a very few minutes the skin had been neatly taken off, and the famishing natives began a ravenous meal on the raw flesh. With the end of the man-eater crisis, Patterson finally had the opportunity to explore the surrounding country and to study the different native races of Africa, a subject in which he was keenly interested. The district immediately around Tsavo was practically uninhabited, but among his workmen he had a good number of Swahili, together with a few Wakamba, Wanyamwezi, and others. So he soon became more or less acquainted with the habits of these tribes. The Swahili, who lived principally along the coast, were a mixed race, the descendants of Arab fathers and Negro mothers. Their name was derived from the Arabic word for coast, Sahil. They were, as a rule, men of splendid physique, well qualified for the calling that most of them followed, that of caravan porters. Patterson described them as a careless, light-hearted, improvident people, very fond of all the good things of this world, enjoying them thoroughly whenever they got the chance. Their life was spent in journeying to and from the interior, carrying heavy loads of provisions and trade goods on one journey, and returning with similar loads of ivory or other products of the country. Many a time, Patterson had watched them trudging along the old caravan road, which crossed the Tsavo at a ford about half a mile from the railway station. There, a halt was always called, so that they might wash and bathe in the cool waters of the river. Nothing ever seemed to damp the spirits of the Swahili porter. Be his life ever so hard, his load ever so heavy, the moment it was off his back and he had disposed of his posho, food, he would straightway forget all his troubles and begin to laugh and sing and joke with his fellows as if he were the happiest mortal alive. Such was Patterson's cook, Mabruki, whose merry laugh was quite infectious. Patterson recalled one day when Mabruki was opening a tin of biscuits for him, and not being able to pull off the underlid with his fingers, he seized the flap in his magnificent teeth and tugged at it. Patterson shouted to him to stop, thinking that he might break a tooth. But Mabruki misunderstood his solicitude and gravely assured him that he would not spoil the tin. The nearest native inhabitants to Tsavo were the Wataita, who dwelled in the mountains near Nindi, some 30 miles away. Patterson's work often took him to this place, and on one of his visits, finding himself with some spare time, he set out to pay a long-promised visit to the district officer. There, he was introduced to Mgogo, the head chief of the Wataita, who had come in for a consultation about some affair of state. The old chief appeared delighted to meet Patterson and promptly invited him to his kraal, some way up in the hills. Patterson jumped at the prospect of seeing the Wataita at home, so they started on a heavy climb up a steep and slippery goat path. After a couple of hours, they arrived at Mgogo's capital, where Patterson was introduced to the chief's wives, who were busily engaged in making pom, a native fermented drink, in the hollowed-out stump of a tree. Like most other natives of Africa, the Wataita were exceedingly superstitious, a failing that was turned to good account by the all-powerful witch doctor or medicine man. It was, Patterson noted, an extraordinary sight to see the absolute faith with which a Kitaita would blow his Simba Dawa, or lion medicine, to the 4 points of the compass before lying down to sleep in the open. This dawa consisted simply of a little black powder, usually carried in a tiny horn stuck through a slit in the ear. But the Kitaita firmly believed that a few grains of this dust blown around him from the palm of his hand was a complete safeguard against raging lions. And after the blowing ceremony, he would lie down to sleep in perfect confidence, even in the midst of a man-eater's district. His faith, in a way, could never be broken, for if he was attacked by a lion, the brute saw to it that he did not live. To become an unbeliever, while if he was not attacked, it was, of course, quite clear that it was to the Dawa that he owed his immunity. Patterson also learned about the Wakamba, a very large tribe who inhabited the Ukambani province. In appearance and dress, or the lack of it, they were very like the Wataita, and they had the same custom of filing their front teeth into sharp points, which gave the whole face a most peculiar and rather diabolical expression. They were a peace-loving people, though when driven to it by hunger, they would commit very cruel acts of murder. During a severe famine that occurred while the railway was being built, hundreds of them died of starvation, and on several occasions they swooped down on isolated railway maintenance gangs and utterly annihilated them, in order to obtain possession of the food which they knew would be stored in the camps. Their only arms were the bow and poisoned arrow, but in the use of these primitive weapons they were specially expert. The arrowhead was designed to remain in the flesh when the shaft was withdrawn, and if the poison was fresh, paralysis and death would very quickly follow, the skin around the wound turning yellow and mortifying within an hour or two. The deadly poison was obtained, Patterson believed, by boiling down a particular root, the arrowheads being dipped in the black, pitchy-looking essence which remained. Having completed the bridge, Patterson was now free to make longer excursions into the surrounding country. He was especially anxious to bag a hippopotamus, and so he made up his mind to try his luck on the banks of the Great Sabaki River, which was formed by the joining of the Tsavo and the Athi rivers about 7 miles downstream from his camp. He possessed no heavy rifle, which is almost a necessity for hippo shooting, but it occurred to him to supply the deficiency by manufacturing a few special cartridges for his 12-bore smooth-bore shotgun. For these, he used double charges of powder and a hardened bullet made of lead mixed with about an 1/8 part of tin. He well remembered the anxiety with which he fired the first round of his homemade ammunition. Half expecting the barrel to burst, he lashed the gun in the fork of a tree, tied a piece of string 100 feet long to the trigger, and then, taking shelter behind a friendly stump, pulled off. To his great satisfaction, the barrel stood the test perfectly. More than that, on testing the penetrative effect of his bullets, he found that they would smash through a steel plate 1/8 of an inch thick at 30 yards range. This, he felt, was good enough for his purpose. He did, however, have a very narrow escape one day while manufacturing this ammunition. His plan was to remove the shot from a standard cartridge, put in the additional powder, and ram this well in before replacing the wad and putting in the bullet. He had clamped his reloading machine to his rough-hewn table and was stamping the double charge of powder well down into the cartridge when suddenly, for some unknown reason, the whole charge exploded right into his face. For a moment, everything became pitch dark to him, and he groped his way about his little hut in an agony of mind as well as of body, for he thought he had been blinded. Thankfully, gleams of light soon began to return to his eyes, and in a few hours he was almost all right again and able to go on with his cartridge making. All his preparations having been made, he set out for the Sabaki, taking with him his Indian gun-bearer Mahina, his cook Mabruki, Abisti, and a couple of natives to carry their odds and ends. Their route lay along the banks of the Tsavo River, a beautiful path shaded by palms and flowering creepers. After about half the distance to the sabaki, they came upon an unexpected obstacle in the shape of a great gorge of barren, rugged rock, about 100 feet high, whose sides went sheer down into the water. Patterson decided to make a detour, but Mahina was confident that he could walk along in the river itself. Patterson mildly hinted at the possibility of crocodiles under the rocky ledges, but Mahina declared there was no danger. He made a bundle of his lower garments, tied it to his back, and stepped into the water. For a few minutes, all went well. Then, in an instant, he was lifted right off his feet by the rush of the water and whirled away. He was swept around a sharp bend and out of sight, the last glimpse they caught of him showing him vainly trying to catch hold of an overhanging branch. Though they made all haste to get around the ridge of rocks, it took them nearly half an hour to do it. Patterson had almost given up hope of ever seeing Mahina again, and was much relieved, therefore, when they reached the riverside once more, to find him safe and sound, having been luckily dashed up against a rushy bank, with no more serious damage than a bruised shin. Eventually, they arrived at the junction of the rivers. After an early dinner, Patterson left his followers encamped in a safe boma, and started out with Mahina to find a suitable tree, near a hippo run, in which to spend the night. They found a likely spot on what was evidently an island during flood time, a place covered with innumerable traces of both hippo and rhino. He picked out a tree close to the river, commanding a stretch of sand which was all flattened down, and looked as if at least one hippo rolled there regularly every night. They settled themselves on a great outspreading branch to begin their vigil. Soon the jungle around them began to come alive with its peculiar sounds. A night bird would call, a crocodile would shut its jaws with a snap, or a rhino or hippo would crash through the bushes on its way to the water. After waiting for a considerable time, a great hippo at last made his appearance and came splashing along in their direction. But unfortunately, it took up a position behind a tree, which, in the most tantalizing way, completely hid it from view. Here it stood, tooting and snorting, and splashing about to its heart's content. For what seemed like hours, Patterson watched for this ungainly creature to emerge from its covert. But as it seemed determined not to show itself, he lost patience and made up his mind to go down after it. He handed his rifle to Mahina to lower to him on reaching the ground and began to descend carefully, holding on by the creepers which encircled the tree. To his intense vexation and disappointment, just as he was in this helpless condition, halfway to the ground, the great hippo suddenly came out from its shelter and calmly lumbered along right underneath him. He could almost have touched its broad back as it passed. It was under these exasperating conditions that he saw a hippo for the first time, and he thought it the ugliest and most forbidding-looking brute he had ever beheld. The moment the great beast passed their tree, it scented them, snorted loudly, and dived into the bushes close by, smashing through them like a traction engine. Shortly after this, another hippo gave forth its tooting challenge a little way down the river. As there seemed no likelihood of getting a shot at it from their tree, Patterson made up his mind to stalk it on foot. He and Mahina descended from their perch and made their way slowly through the trees in the semi-darkness, their nerves strung to the highest pitch as they imagined a rhino or a lion ready to charge out of every shadow. They reached the edge of the river in safety, only to find that they were again balked by a small, rush-covered island, on the other side of which their quarry could be heard. There was a good breeze blowing from the hippo towards them, so Patterson thought the best thing to do was to attempt to get onto the island and have a shot at him from there. They let themselves quietly into the water, which was only knee-deep, and waded slowly across. On peering cautiously through the reeds at the corner of the island, Patterson was surprised to find that he could see nothing of the hippo. But then he realized he was looking too far ahead. He lowered his eyes, and there it was, not 25 yards away, lying down in the shallow water, only half covered and practically facing them. Its closeness made him anxious, especially as just then it rose to its feet and gave forth its peculiar call. All the same, as the great beast raised its head, Patterson fired at it. It whirled round, made a plunge forward, staggered, and fell, and then lay quite still. To make assurance doubly sure, he gave it a couple more bullets as it lay, but they found afterwards that his first shot had been a very lucky one and had penetrated the brain. The long night's hunt was over. In the morning, the natives cut out the tusks and feasted ravenously on the flesh, while Patterson turned his attention with gratitude to the hot coffee and cakes which Mabruki had prepared. The demons of Tsavo had been conquered, and now the other great beasts of this wild land were, one by one, revealing themselves to the intrepid engineer.